And another particularly ugly thing that happened during that 6-day war 50 years ago was an American ship. It was a spy ship. We had it anchored off of Egypt called the USS Liberty. It was attacked by Israeli jets. And as a matter of fact, the Israeli jets weren't even marked. They created these neutral jets and just flew them over there. And this ship, the USS Liberty, had huge, oversized parades. They have these big flags, right? An American flag, and they pulled out their parade flag, which is a giant flag that they wave, when they're in these big, wonderful ceremonies. Their party flag. They pulled out the big flag to make sure that the Israelis that were attacking them would know, hey, you're attacking your ally. 50 years ago, they were our ally, just as they are now. These unmarked Israeli jets, they mercilessly strafed the ship for hours. They were even shooting at the guys in rafts. They were trying to get away from the ship, thinking it was going to sink on them. They strafed it mercilessly. They machine gun fire and small cannon fire from these ships. All air assistance that came, we had planes that were going out there to assist them, to fight off these jets, and they were called back. Johnson, the president at the time, said he wanted that ship at the bottom of the sea. That's a quote that the people that around him heard him say on the phone to the commanders in the area, that he wanted that goddamn ship at the bottom of the sea. And I'll tell you what, it gets even sicker than that. There's one of the survivors of the USS Liberty went around and did some research, and he discovered, I don't know if this is true or not, but this is what he said. He wrote a book about it, that a United States submarine that was their escort, that even their escort, a submarine, fired a torpedo into the side of the USS Liberty in an attempt to sink it. Quite possibly one of the most treasonous events in our history, our ally attacking one of our ships. Other things I remember reading about was that one of the reasons maybe they wanted to take it down, because at the time they were tape recording communications, because it was a spy ship, which was pretty horrible evidence that the Israelis were mass murdering Egyptian soldiers. They were lining them up and executing them. So there's an awful lot of sordid history that gets covered up in the fog of decades of history goes by. What else can we talk about on this beautiful, beautiful Saturday evening? Washington has intensified its anti-Russian trade sanctions over its alleged complicity in the Ukraine crisis. Oh, really now? Washington, D.C., they've intensified their anti-Russian trade sanctions over its alleged complicity in the Ukraine crisis. What complicity? Russia didn't do nothing. Russia's always been an ally to the Ukrainians and a trade partner. Until, of course, they had that coup where they flipped the leadership. Ukraine basically was doing Russia wrong. Russia had a pipeline through there, and the Ukrainians were siphoning off gas. It was natural gas, and they reneged on the deal. They were allowed to do it because that was Russia needed a nice direct route to sell their natural gas in Europe. So Ukraine reneged on the deal, the pipeline deal, with Russia. I mean, they're the bad guys at the time. Russia had nothing to do with this ouster of Yanukovych, which even the CIA called the most blatant coup in history. And the CIA should know because they commit most, if not all, these blatant coups in history. For the pot to call the kettle black is pretty obvious to me. This latest round of sanctions, though, they were announced during a visit by Ukrainian President Petro Porky Pig Poroshenko, the chocolate kingpin, to Washington. I know he's another guy who came out of nowhere. Who's this Poroshenko guy? He was a chocolate kingpin. I guess George Soros really likes chocolate, so they became friends somewhere at a chocolate factory, sitting there picking out on chocolate, and now they're best buddies. He says, I'm going to make you the king of Ukraine. Come on, you're my buddy. Well, anyway, last year, Poroshenko petitioned the Constitutional Court of Ukraine in a document saying, quote, I ask the court to acknowledge that the law on the removal of the presidential title from Viktor Yanukovych as unconstitutional. He was saying that it was a coup back then, a year ago. He was saying that he was placed into power, that Poroshenko was saying that I was placed into power through a coup. You know, he was conceding it because he knew that he would be next. Because these neo-Nazis that came in and took over Ukraine, they aren't the nicest kids on the block. And neither are his alleged friends in Washington that set the whole thing up. So he knew he couldn't trust Washington, and he couldn't trust these crazy Nazi guys, literal Nazis, that were suddenly in power. Guys running around with swastikas tattooed on their face. I mean, come on. You know what I'm saying? These are the Antifa crazoids that have taken over the country. So now they're making life difficult for businesses in Crimea with their sanctions. You know, the EU has blocked the import of products from Crimea and halted any European investments or real estate purchases, and they prevent cruise ships from stopping in Crimea. What? They won't let the cruise ships stop in Crimea? How crazy is that? I don't know. Things will probably smooth over, but, you know, Crimea declared independence from Ukraine 3 years ago, and they formally applied to become part of the Russian Federation following a referendum in which the majority of the people voted to separate from Ukraine and reunite with Russia. Mother Russia, the people. A lot of Ukrainians, not just in Ukraine, consider themselves Russians. They speak Russian. Why am I yelling at you? You're my friends. I'm sorry. This sort of thing it's irritating that our country does this petty stuff all over the planet. These sanctions are not a nice thing. Anyway, Soros, right? He's a known funder of the neo-Nazis, the Antifa crazoids that protest in our country. They were protesting around the university. You see them out there in the streets all the time. A bunch of youngsters with the what are they called, balaclava masks over their faces, acting crazy. And you know, I've seen people go up and interview them, and they barely understand why they're there. All they know is that somebody paid them to show up and carry a sign and act crazy and knock things over and break windows and start fires. And they talk about, you know, no government. Yay, we're just going to shut it down, you know, just block the streets and ruin things. It's insanity. And for some reason, the police seem to just let them do what they want. Conspiracy? Possibly. So anyway, in the Donbass region of Ukraine, that's the eastern Ukraine, that's these two areas called Donetsk and Lugansk, they share most of their borders with Russia. And Russia is actually helping them to survive this civil war that's been imposed upon them. So Russia it didn't start any of this, but they're there, you know, to lend a helping hand. It's kind of like Qatar. What's that story on Qatar? It's crazy. Qatar used to be, all of a sudden after Trump went over there and touched the orb and hung out with the Saud, the House of Saud, and all these little satellite countries around the Arabian Peninsula, all those kingdoms, if you will, they all hovered around Trump because he's the bringer of super money and super weapons. All of a sudden, Qatar, they've become vilified. And that's where Al Jazeera came from, right? Well, last time I looked at Al Jazeera, they pretty much looked like they'd been taken over by the same people that took over our media, and so they're not to be trusted hardly anymore. A lot of media outlets have been taken down and made to go to the dark side. They've gone over to the dark side, and they spread the propaganda of the global elite. But Iran sends food over there to Qatar. Qatar's a small country, and it's got a small population. I think Austin, Texas has a larger population than the entire country of Qatar. They call themselves Qatar. Over here in Texas, we call them Qatar. So, but you know what I'm talking about. People be helping, the people that they say are the bad guys. They're trying desperately to help people survive this insanity that is the takeover of the planet by these banking elite that control our military and the military of the NATO and all these bad guys. They're bad guys. I'm telling you, they're bad guys. Moving right along, another bill. All these bills coming through our government, they're aimed at imposing new sanctions on Iran and Russia. They got a bill that has two sanctions in one. Hey, let's talk about economy of motion. This bill has hit a roadblock in the U.S. House of Representatives. Last week, senators voted 98-2 to pass the Countering Iran's Destabilizing Activities Act, to which anti-Russia sanctions were also attached. There's like a little rider there. So, you can tell the senators, 98-2, it pretty much shows you how taken over our government is, how owned by the elite our government is. When you see a vote like that at 98-2, I just want to send a box of candy to the two that voted against this stupid bill. But, it hit some snags. It's like before it's signed into law by Trump, it has to pass the House. And lawmakers are now arguing that the legislation violates the U.S. Constitution. What? It violates the Constitution? Well, the so-called blue slip violation, they call it. It occurs thanks to a constitutional requirement which stipulates that any bill raising revenue for the government must originate in the House, not the Senate. So they got this bill imposing sanctions on Iran and Russia. How does that actually raise revenue for the government? Somewhere in there, somebody's getting a handout, which is, I guess, the main reason for any bill, wouldn't you say? So it must originate in the House and not the Senate. Potato, let's call the whole thing off. Well, that's just an interesting little aside, because, the powers that be, they're going to get their sanctions. As long as we allow these bastards to stay in power, ladies and gentlemen, they're going to get their sanctions. And sanctions, they could be horrible things. We sanctioned Iraq for 10 years before we invaded them. That's right, before we invaded them. It was during Bill Clinton's time, sanctioning Iraq. I don't know what his excuse was, but 1 million people starved to death in those 10 years, mostly children and women. That's what we do. We Americans ought to be really proud, or that was a terrible, terrible attempt at humor. We ought to be really angry that our government is responsible for such amazingly large amounts of people being killed by starvation. It's like, it reminds me of Yemen. It's because of us, the Saudis wouldn't be able to do what they're doing in Yemen. They're murdering, mass murdering. The typhoid and starvation is rampant over there, not to mention an awful lot of explosions going on. So we're bad guys.